Hey guys, we've got two messages left in First Peter. This week we're closing out finally this really long section on Christian suffering. We're going to be focused a lot on why God sends suffering on His people specifically in this life. We'll talk a lot about how God uses trials, difficulties, suffering for our faith to test and to refine our faith. You guys will open up with the question of if they have any other questions, clarifications, comments, anything they want to dig deeper into from the lesson. And then you've got a couple questions to go through. The first one is, should we ever, or should we never, or should we always try to discern why God might be allowing us to suffer? This is a big question. It's a helpful question to go through. It flows nicely out of my lesson where I'll be talking about, God does have a reason for sending suffering, using suffering in the lives of His people. And then it becomes a more personal question of, should we try to figure that out, or do we just kind of let it happen to us, let God shape us kind of unknowingly, or at least we maybe won't realize until way in the future. And I've got some thoughts there for you to kind of keep you guided in the guardrails. We'll see what students say. It's a difficult question to answer. I think the short answer is yes. I think we should always try to discern why God might be allowing something to happen in our lives. If we really think that God is sovereign, then we should not go through life just assuming that everything happens to us by chance and happenstance, and there's no rhyme or reason, or there's no answer to the question of why. The psalmists ask why oftentimes in their prayers, but at the same time, we've got to remember we're not going to always immediately be able to discern why. God's ways are higher than our ways, and so we won't be able to immediately figure that out. And there is some danger in dwelling on it too long, getting too caught up in this question. Job and his friends, they spend almost the entire book of Job, each of them trying to take stabs at why is God allowing this to happen in your life. And God seems frustrated with Job's friends, mostly because they guessed incorrectly, but probably also because they just sat and tried to question God over and over and over. And so there is a limit to this. But we miss out on a lot if we don't ask, why would God allow this to happen? Why is God moving this circumstance in this way? We do have evidence in the New Testament of Paul figuring out, discerning, saying, God allowed this to happen because of this. Now, 2 Corinthians 1:9 is a good example of that. I'll use that in a lesson, and you can reference back to it. Paul talks about intense suffering that they faced in their missionary journeys, and he says this was to make us rely on God instead of ourselves. And so he has the suffering, and he also has the reason why God allowed the suffering. He does the same thing later in the same book when he talks about his thorn in the flesh. He says, God gave me this thorn in the flesh so that I wouldn't become conceited or prideful. And so Paul seems to be asking that question of, this is happening in my life. It is from God. And so why might this be happening? And so I think we should always ask that question, but we've got to realize our limits as well. Next question is on verses 17 and 18 in 1 Peter 4, where it says, it's time for judgment to begin at the household of God. And if it begins with us, what will be the outcome of those who do not obey the gospel? And if the righteous are scarcely saved, what will become of the ungodly and the sinner? And I think the message that Peter's sending a message both to believers and to unbelievers in those verses, and they should be able to unpack kind of easily what the message to believers is based on our lesson, that Peter's kind of saying we shouldn't be surprised. Judgment is beginning now, this judgment of suffering, this shaping, forming, purifying judgment God is sending on His people now. And then there will be a final judgment where God does the same thing. He tests and purifies, separates believers from unbelievers. And so the message to believers is, don't be surprised that this judgment of suffering is happening in your life. So it's kind of reiterating what he said in verse 12. But we want to ask, the students what they think Peter's message is to the other half, to the unbelievers. What is Peter trying to say to them in these verses? A lot of people, a lot of translations in verse 18 say if the righteous are saved with difficulty, not if the righteous are scarcely saved. I think that makes the meaning a little more apparent. I think that may be a better translation. So you can give them that translation, see if that helps. The message Peter's sending to unbelievers is that if Christians are saved through suffering in this life, how much worse is the fate that awaits unbelievers in the next life? If God is saving his people through suffering now, what kind of suffering awaits those who don't obey the gospel in eternity? So it's intended to be this kind of strong word of warning that hopefully moves people towards Christ, which plays into the next question. And you ask, what kind of role should this kind of speech have in our preaching, in our evangelism, in our conversations with others about the gospel? Should we talk about hell? Should we talk about judgment? Should we warn people about that in our preaching and in our gospel conversations? Ever? Often? What should we do with that? This is another big, semi-common question. Could get a lot of thoughts on this. It used to be a lot more common. Jesus preaches a lot on hell. The church throughout the ages has often preached a lot on hell. Jonathan Edwards, one of his most famous sermons is Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, and it's all about God's wrath and God's judgment. We don't hear those sermons all too often anymore, and there are dangers to it. So we kind of saw that can be bad and unhelpful if that's all that you're focused on. You get the hellfire and brimstone preachers that are stereotypical, and we want to avoid that. And yet, in avoiding that, we've sometimes taken hell completely out of our theology, and that's dangerous. That's falling off the horse on the other side. People today really need to be confronted with this idea of eternity. It's not one that they probably agree with immediately, but they need to hear that, because in our day and age, people are kind of in a you do you, I'll do me, this Christian thing. It might work for you. It may lead to a happier life for you. I'm not sure it will for me. I don't know. We'll see. And if we focus only on this life, though Christianity does bring, I believe, great benefits into our life here and now, but if we only focus on that, people will quickly just disagree or say that's our opinion and what they're doing seems to be working for them now. But when faced with eternity, that's a much bigger question, and it's not objective that there's a benefit to being a Christian, at least within the Christian worldview, eternally. And so people need to be confronted with that idea. We need to bring that back into our preaching, into our teaching, into our evangelism. People have to be confronted with that idea, as uncomfortable as it is, oftentimes to move them away from their sin. Last thing, if you have time, some of these questions could go long. Try to, on question 4 and question 2, have some good discussion there, but also recognize that there are limits to giving a perfect answer on those. So you don't want to get too caught up in the weeds in those maybe. The last one is I'll talk about how suffering is a mark. Peter seems to treat suffering as a mark of true Christians, of genuine faith. And so you're going to ask, what are other marks of true believers, of genuine faith that God gives us in his word to assure us of our faith or to wake us up to the fact that we might not have real faith? And I've listed some here. Let them see what they can come up with. Challenge them to try to tie what they're saying to Scripture, to specific verses, or at least paraphrases that they can maybe come up with. But going through this list could be helpful. You can go through that on your own. It's pretty self-explanatory. Have them read the verses even if you have time. But yeah, that's I think a good thing to remind our kids about. Again, for both of those benefits. Hopefully it will assure some that may be doubting in their faith, which is common in teenage years, and it also might rock the boat a little bit for those who just assume that they are followers of Christ and they might not in fact be. And so I like to hit on this stuff as often as we have an opportunity, and we kind of have an opening for it this week. That's all I got. I'll see you guys on Sunday. Let me know if you have questions.